All right. Well, we may have some more people joining us in the next few minutes, but I want to go ahead and get started and just extend a warm welcome and thank you to those of you who are here and made it to join us on time. I really want to welcome you to this program. This is a webinar called Psychedelics in Recovery. I'm Elizabeth Nielsen. I'm the co-founder of Fluence, and I'm here to host and just facilitate this time together. This program will be an hour long, and we'll have lots of time for questions and answers towards the end. So just by way of housekeeping to start, for those of you who are curious and you'd like to say hi to each other or hi to anyone, particularly on the panel, the speakers, you can use the chat. We've got the chat enabled for you today. So you're welcome to just greet the group, say hi. Maybe you see some classmates or friends here. It's a small world, so we do run into each other. And you've also got the Q&A function available to you. So today, if you've got questions that you'd like us to address as speakers, you're welcome to put those in the Q&A, and we encourage you to do so. It's a little easier for us to find them and make sure that we're addressing them. We might not get to all of them, but we do want to know what your specific questions are. So again, like I said, we've got a few more people filing in here just in these early minutes of the webinar. I'm Elizabeth Nielsen, and I'm the co-founder of Fluence. I'm going to be hosting this program. On the line with me, there you'll see a couple of Fluence people labeled Fluence on the panel. Those are our video crew and Selah, who's helping to answer some questions. So you might hear from them in the chat or on the Q&A. They're also here to assist, but they're going to be with the cameras off just in the background, making sure everything runs smoothly for all of you. So by way of welcome, I just want to give a brief overview. Many of you, I think, have been to Fluence webinars before, or maybe you just heard about this one. We're really glad you came out to join us either way. We try to host a webinar about every once a month at least to bring in different speakers and topics that are of interest to students and mostly clinicians who are trying to get involved in the field of psychedelics, or maybe have been involved in the field for some time and are just looking for a program that's going to be enriching and interesting and provide some conversation for you. So this program is one of a line of many, and I encourage you to check out our other offerings all online at fluencetraining.com. You'll get email follow-up from us. You'll get a link with the recording to this. If you are, have to step out early or you have a bad connection, don't worry, we'll make it available to you. Just a word about Fluence. We are an education program. We started with a series of workshops actually as far back as 2018 in New York. And we've really taken the lead in educating clinicians about psychedelic harm reduction and integration. We have a number of other programs now. We provide continuing education programs for clinicians. And we have a licensure qualifying program operating in Oregon to educate people who want to become facilitators, psilocybin facilitators in Oregon. We also do a number of projects in the research world and present at a lot of conferences. So if you haven't seen us around yet, we look forward to meeting you somewhere when you do. So today's program, I just want to say, is really a special program, and I think a special moment for us. My background in the field really started as an addiction psychologist, and my interest in working with psychedelics grew out of an interest in working to find better ways of working with people who are struggling with addiction. As many of you are aware, to varying degrees, I'm sure, the field of addiction treatment is really sorely lacking in terms of the resources and the actual offerings that are available to help people struggling in those ways. There's a big gap between what research shows us is possible and what's actually available for people and what's actually on offer and actually can be helpful. So I think this is one of the sort of subspecialties of the field of psychedelics where we don't always get a whole lot of airtime. It's not always the easiest topic to talk about. Maybe research is behind what it's like in some other areas, for instance, with depression or PTSD, that feel a little more accessible for researchers to work with. But it's a very, very important aspect of our field. And I do think that there's great room for improvement there, and great room for conversation about how psychedelics can be helpful in this way. So today I've invited a guest speaker, Kevin Franciati, here, and I'll have him introduce himself in just a minute. But to give a little more history, Kevin and I actually met during around that same time in New York, and we had a common affiliation with the New School for Social Research, which is a program that teaches a very progressive, harm reduction informed way of thinking about and working with addiction problems. And we kept up correspondence a little bit sporadically since then, but have remained in touch and continue to share this interest in the ways that psychedelics could be beneficial or helpful for people who are struggling with addiction. Kevin's had some really interesting experiences in the field and done some really interesting work. And so I want to invite him to actually just introduce himself and say a little bit more.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks to the team at Fluence for putting this webinar together, and thank you all for your interest in coming out to hear more about the context, broader context of the use of psychedelics for addiction treatment, and then the idea of incorporating elements of psychedelic integration with the prevalence of mutual aid communities in addiction recovery. So those are predominantly the 12-step oriented ones, and then some alternatives to that approach. But briefly, I'm a licensed addiction counselor based in Colorado. I completed my master's at the New School with a concentration in mental health and substance abuse counseling, as Elizabeth alluded to earlier. I have been a longstanding obsessive in the psychedelic world, and became interested towards the end of high school, early college, and had a number of experiences as an undergrad that really helped kind of propel my interest into a more professional and academic capacity. First starting as a research assistant at Harvard's McLean Hospital during the MDMA for cancer anxiety study that was being conducted back then. And then shortly after that, I hosted a 3-day conference at Northeastern University through a student group that I helped start, a chapter of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. That was a 3-day conference on Ibogaine, which later came up in my own recovery journey to help with addiction interruption. And I was a MAPS trial participant in 2011 after my Ibogaine treatment in Mexico for opiate use disorder. And I was a participant in the observational trial that MAPS had been sponsoring, conducted by Tom Brown. So now I'm just in private practice. I do ketamine-assisted therapy, and I'm really just honored to have the opportunity to say a little bit about my story in the larger context of this hugely critical issue that we have in the United States and other countries around the world, with a devastating toll on addiction, and how both psychedelics for treatment could be utilized in that, and then how peer-based communities can help support each other and hold each other accountable for their own recovery. So looking forward to elaborating more on some of these themes. So thanks for having me.
I'm muting myself. There was a message in my view. I just want to really thank you so much for coming out and taking the time to do this and be here with us and this audience. I thought it might be helpful to give a little bit of backstory, just a little bit of history for folks that might not be familiar with even what Ibogaine is, and how just how we think about psychedelics in general being a piece of addiction treatment, or the addiction recovery process, if you will.
Yeah, and this and other questions, I'm going to do my best to not speak constantly and breathe every now and then, because there's just so much detail to unpack, and I highly recommend people treat the content that's being covered here as kind of a broad introduction, and there are many ways to take deeper dives. So just a couple of contextual factors that I think are really important, as Elizabeth alluded to in her intro, that the field of addiction treatment and addiction psychology has been heavily lacking in innovation for going on decades. And oddly enough, we have one of the most robust treatment options in terms of medications for opiate use disorder that have fairly decent outcomes, but as we're seeing from the fentanyl crisis, we're really needing to chart a different course. But to back up about 100 years ago, the state of addiction treatment in the United States was pretty devastating, as you can imagine, with kind of the moral failing model as the prevailing idea about who struggles with drug abuse, drug addiction, alcoholism. It had been viewed in the context as a moral failing and not a disease. And so at the time, there were in psychiatric practice, the institutionalization of some of the most chronic persisting conditions for people that just wouldn't respond to traditional lines of therapy or treatment. And alcoholism, severe alcoholism, was one of those that it was kind of just relegated to. We don't really know what to do with these folks that just can't get it together. So we're going to warehouse them. We're going to potentially put them up for brain surgery and just crazy things. And so the flash forward a couple of decades, and now we're talking about the beginnings of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's kind of the pioneering model of imagining the idea of a personal struggle with a substance-related condition as being a legitimate disease. Alcoholics Anonymous was born out of a prior group that had a stronger affiliation to kind of religious doctrine, and AA to this day has kind of been unable to shake its affiliation as a spiritual tradition, incorporating a lot of Judeo-Christian ideas. But I think for the purpose of this aspect of the context of things, AA really thrust the conversation about the disease model of alcoholism and was able to really help medicalize this idea of people deserving treatment, which later then included the Minnesota model, as some folks who might be familiar with the Hazelden, Betty Ford merger later on, and then just kind of compelling insurance companies to recognize the reimbursement utility of treatment. And so about 2 decades or so after the founding, a little bit less than that, of Alcoholics Anonymous in the late 30s, now you're talking right around several years out from the discovery of LSD. Mescaline had been researched prior to that in some limited capacities, but after LSD was discovered by Albert Hoffman at Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, and just widespread experimentation among leaders in the psychiatric world that Sandoz was sending samples to, the research of the golden era, so-called golden era of psychedelic research in the 50s, included a very specific indication for the treatment of alcohol use disorder, among other significant mental health conditions. So there was the group in Saskatchewan in Canada, a group in Hollywood, and then of course in Maryland at the Maryland Psychiatric Center. And so for the purposes of this initial line of inquiry, the treatment of alcohol use disorder was a predominant one in this model. And so even Bill Wilson himself, not receiving treatment for alcohol use disorder, but later on in his life for depression, which becomes a little bit relevant later on in this conversation for psychedelics and recovery. But that's kind of a rough sketch about what was going on in the 50s. Obviously, there's been a long tradition of indigenous practices and communities. More contemporary settings is familiarity with the Native American church and the peyote ceremony. And as we've seen in the United States and Canada, how much alcohol has ravaged Native communities, and how the veneration of peyote in the Native American church and other spiritual traditions has really led to a resurgence in healing among those communities. And so, the so-called psychedelic renaissance that we've been in for the past couple of decades just naturally renewed that line of research, and clinical trial sites such as at NYU and Hopkins, among others, have been looking primarily at psilocybin for various substance-related indications, including alcohol, nicotine, more recently opiate and stimulant use disorder. And then the only other clinical trial that I believe has picked up more momentum lately is for MDMA, assisted therapy for the treatment of alcohol use disorder. Very lastly, the ibogaine that I mentioned earlier, ibogaine derived from the root bark of a shrub indigenous to Western Equatorial Africa and the modern day countries of Gabon, Cameroon, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, was discovered in the West, of course. When I say discovered, it's of course biased to our Western understanding. Iboga, similar to peyote in many ways, has a cultural tradition that goes back possibly beyond millennia that we can even comprehend before even written history. So in 1962, there's a discovery of ibogaine ability to interrupt addiction, and most importantly, to attenuate the symptoms of opiate withdrawal, which many people struggling with opiate use disorder can't wrap their heads around embracing the idea of recovery, because first they need to get through that really grueling period of acute withdrawal from the physiological dependency. So in 1962, a man named Howard Lotsof in New York City, a film student, interested in psychology, interested in drugs, addicted to heroin at the time, and I believe methadone as well, was just hanging out with friends, as one does, and an enterprising chemist friend of his offers him a capsule of ibogaine that he just unwittingly takes, not really knowing what to expect. And as the story kind of goes, a few days later, Howard is walking up to his front steps in Staten Island. And normally when he's doing this is returning home after a bender. And he usually is thinking, when am I going to score again, right? How long am I going to allow myself to rest before I have to start this process all over again? Coming out of ibogaine, instead, he's walking up his front steps and realizes, I haven't used heroin in over 48 hours. I haven't been through withdrawal, and I have no cravings whatsoever. And so for the next several decades, attempted to engage with any legitimate researcher looking to potentially develop ibogaine for treatment. That hasn't really gone very far for a variety of complicating factors, but interestingly, around the world, there's a number of countries that don't quite explicitly legalize like a government-approved form of therapy. I believe the state of Sao Paulo in Brazil is the only government body that has actually declared an ibogaine treatment as a legitimate form of government-endorsed addiction intervention. But there's a number of countries around the world that have more of a legal gray area, and it's kind of considered unregulated, meaning kind of tolerated, somewhat similar to how cannabis operates in Amsterdam, for example. So there's been clinics that operate around the world that offer ibogaine treatment, primarily for detox, more recently for a lot of vets with PTSD. And so in 2011, when I was in need of my own detox, I traveled down to Mexico to receive addiction interrupting treatment, and had a very, very similar experience as Howard Lotsof, just an earth-shattering kind of transformative psychological experience with severely attenuated opiate withdrawal. So hardly any true withdrawals that I was afraid of. And in addition to helping me detox off of heroin at the time, I also quit smoking as a result. So it accomplished both of those things in a single intervention, and it helped launch my my recovery journey, which I'll be happy to get into a little bit later as well.
Thanks, Kevin. It is a really rich history. And, as I was listening, I was thinking too, we're talking about talking about psychedelics and things that have been used historically in spiritual practices, right? And we're either talking about organic compounds or derivatives thereof in some way or some iteration, somewhere down the line. Even LSD can be considered a semi-organic or a derivative of a naturally occurring psychoactive. And there's this feeling of that history really referencing use in a spiritual practice. And at the same time, when I think of what you said about AA and that fellowship, there's also reference to a spiritual practice or a process of spiritual discovery, you might say, not necessarily beholden to any one religion. But I do think it's an interesting parallel and ironic that we've kind of come around to this particular use in our research models and in our clinical models. And yet there is also this link on both sides of sort of referencing a spiritual process there, something about higher meaning maybe, or you're really helping people in a very profound way.
Yeah, absolutely. And to kind of go back a little further, in Bill W., the co-founder of AA, his own journey involved a few stays at Towns Hospital in New York City, what was considered the premier hospital for an intervention for severe alcoholics who weren't able to find a way out of that disease in less severe ways. And Towns Hospital kind of was known to combine a whole variety of chemical intoxicants, deliriants, and anything in the pharmacopoeia that could be even minimally helpful in lessening the severity of the struggle of alcoholics that went through there. So Bill W. Was given, among other things, what's called the belladonna treatment. And he writes about his white light encounter with essentially God, that during his final hospital stay was likely, the true verifiable historical documentation is somewhat limited, but because of how prevalent we know of this treatment at this hospital, it's very likely that Bill Wilson's initial white light encounter was facilitated by belladonna and the other drugs he was on, in addition to being in that kind of acute DT state of alcohol withdrawal. And then later went on to channel that spiritual discovery into this idea of really recognizing the role of a spiritual-based lifestyle in embracing a pursuit of recovery. So decades later, when he was treated with depression with LSD, the experience that he had in the kind of spiritual aspects of it reminded him, of course, of this white light encounter. And he could imagine a place with severe alcoholics in AA who couldn't really wrap their head around spirituality, or what the point of working the 12 steps to having a spiritual awakening that would basically put me in a position to now help other people. Like that's the goal. How can you see that when you're really severely struggling in that acute stage? And so he thought that the idea of treating struggling alcoholics with LSD would kind of give them a glimpse of what a spiritual pursuit could have to offer through a more rigorous application of the 12 steps.
Yeah. Yeah, again, it's an interesting phenomenon in terms of giving someone the capacity to imagine or see things that they don't currently have within their scope of imagination, or their field of vision or perception. I wanted to sort of shift gears for a second to a question that I often have gotten because of my work also in research in this field. And a lot of even clinicians, the general public as well, don't have a whole lot of familiarity or information about the ways that modern medicine, modern clinical care already incorporates a variety of drugs, a variety of pharmacological treatments. And so there may be some questioning there, like, oh, you're going to give people another drug? Like, aren't we trying to get off drugs? How does that work? Is that consistent? Is that incompatible with, being in recovery? So I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to the entire picture of what medication-assisted treatment looks like and how this fits into that idea, and also how it's different from the existing medications that we use when we talk about medication-assisted treatment, or MAT.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And as I mentioned in the beginning, that the treatment of alcoholics struggled with the kind of moralized model of what it meant to actually be someone who suffers from that indication. Some of the legacies of that idea, this moralistic framing, continue to exist. And I sort of kind of couch that under what Elizabeth's question was, with regards to, well, aren't you just kind of substituting one drug for another, and getting someone off of a drug by another drug just doesn't make sense? Why can't the individual just quit entirely? A couple of things worth mentioning, but I think also far more interestingly in the pharmacological sense, that we've been using what's called medication-assisted therapy, sometimes referred to as drug replacement therapy, sometimes referred to as maintenance therapy. And essentially, there's three classes broadly of drugs of abuse that have the most legacy of this type of pharmacological intervention. Those would be nicotine, alcohol, and opiates. We don't really see this with stimulants or other things. And so, we're familiar with the idea of the Nicorette gum or a nicotine patch to really allow somebody in a kind of a harm reduction idea to transfer their physiological dependency onto a safer version of nicotine consumption that doesn't include the combustion of tobacco products or the use of chewing tobacco and the devastating health impacts that could elicit. With alcohol, we kind of have a sort of a strange take on inducing aversion to the experience of alcohol through a medication known as antabuse. And this would be to get, after an alcoholic is detoxed from the acute physiological dependency, and now it's kind of more of the psychological dependence that you're working off of in order to kind of help protect them at another layer of protection if they were to choose to ingest an alcoholic substance. If they're on this medication, they would literally become sick, and they would the goal was that they would attempt to develop an aversion to the taste, smell, and feeling of those initial ingestions that compel them to get sick. Then you have the Vivitrol shot. Vivitrol is a long-acting injection of naltrexone, which was primarily developed for treatment of opiate use disorder. So it's an actual blocker of the ability for an opiate to sit on the receptor. So without going too much further into the weeds there, I think we kind of get the picture that these, whatever you want to call them, are designed to be taken regularly or long-term. And I think what the biggest difference is when we talk about the use of psychedelic medicines is specific to this intervention, whether we're doing it in a controlled clinical context or whether individuals in a peer model among communities or among close family and friends are doing this themselves for personal spiritual growth or broader kind of recovery fulfillment. These are compounds that are used kind of a handful of times and are not really designed to be used regularly. We know that psychedelics are inherently anti-addictive in terms of just the rapid tolerance increase that would not really realistically allow somebody to be using a psychedelic every day for very long. Not to mention the nature of the experiences are pretty challenging. You have to arrange to take off several hours worth of obligations to complete it. So it's not the kind of thing that people repeat regularly. And then lastly, psychedelics can bring on euphoria. They can bring on like enhanced sensory experience. They can open people up to quality relational exchange with their loved ones. They can also be very confrontational types of experiences, and particularly with people who struggle with addiction. In order to persist in an addictive lifestyle, it's really impossible to have done that without burning some bridges in your life. And so psychedelics, the phenomenology, winds up confronting people with feelings that they've been seeking to avoid, things like guilt, shame, remorse, regret, things that keep an addiction cycle going. And so whether it's designed to be given as myself and even Howard Lotzoff or Bill Wilson, who we've talked about, as a single intervention to facilitate detox, or years down the line when it's done for other mental health reasons to maybe stave off a potential relapse from happening. The point is that these are not designed to be everyday maintenance type drugs.
Yeah, thank you. It's a really important distinction. As you were speaking, you mentioned this phenomena of guilt and shame and broken relationships and things that can just really drive this much further towards a cycle. And so I think that many of you here, I'm sure, are familiar with psychedelic research and the sort of methodology or the approach that's used. But I do see this as very much about being something that can help break that cycle in a number of ways. Some of the things that I was really just very fortunate to be able to witness in the work that I did with psilocybin for alcohol use disorder in research was just truly people being able to shift that that internal cycle of guilt and shame that can be so powerful that it does really turn something into a cycle otherwise. So you don't just see changes in the behavior, but you actually see changes in the internal process that's surrounding it and that's driving it. And I think a lot of therapies have really tried to get at that. If you look at things like relapse prevention strategies, where you're talking about, you're talking about strategies to mitigate that, to mitigate those kinds of thoughts. There are attempts to do that, but this offers a really powerful opportunity to support that process.
And a deeply personal and subjective one. And I think the nature of direct experience, it's hard to ignore that, right? When we're confronted with issues that we've been hiding from, and that comes foremost on the mind in these non-ordinary states, it's in your face, and you either continue to resist it and suffer the consequences, or among facilitators in an intentional context, that is the healing. That is the way to allow people to open up, to embrace recovery.
Great. I'm going to pause just for a second to remind everyone to please, if you've got questions or there's something you'd like to know more about, please do pop that into the Q&A for us so that we'll be able to see it. It's a little hard to peruse the whole chat, but it's really helpful, and we do want to address some of your questions and the things that that you're more interested in. I've got another question or two for Kevin here, so I'm going to keep going for the time being, but could you say a little bit about Psychedelics in Recovery, the fellowship, what it means, how it's different from other recovery fellowships, and just kind of give us that context about Psychedelics in Recovery?
Yeah, so Psychedelics in Recovery has been around since late 2015 into 2016, but in kind of bringing back to my biographical journey, my Ibogaine treatment, right? I was lucky and privileged to have a loving family that I hadn't burned that bridge yet, that was willing to contribute to me being able to even receive that treatment. And sort of the, to use a pejorative, the kind of junkie bargaining that I pled to my parents in their way of the discussion to offer this treatment for me was to say, I'll go now after this detox into a halfway house, commit to, the abstinence recovery lifestyle. So basically just go from one polar opposite end of the mainstream into the very heart of the mainstream, particularly in South Florida, which is where I wound up after my treatment. And so, the thing that I like to touch on here is I spent the last couple of years of my addiction in profound isolation, right? I was leaving my house in the middle of the night, avoiding everybody, only ever having interactions with my dealer, hardly a socially fulfilling lifestyle. And so to go from this intensely psychedelic experience, this transformative treatment, into an abstinence-based community surrounded by people that I'm, being encouraged to engage with, approach a sponsor to help work me through the steps. It was just a very disorienting social milieu to adapt to. And the ways that people would make small talk were things like, what was your drug of choice? What treatment center did you go to? And every time I would engage in that conversation and say something like Mexico, it would just cascade a series of follow-up questions that were very disillusioning. And so very quickly, when I found that I really couldn't talk authentically about the significance of my Ibogaine experience, I became very withdrawn, and I started just referring to that in the ways that I shared in meetings or shared my story was the detox that I received, just kept it very vague. So that became pretty discouraging after a while. And I'm celebrating, 4 years in a traditional 12-step based recovery fellowship, and I had been able to build my life back. But I'd maintained an interest in psychedelics, and I figured I couldn't possibly have been the only one to have thought of this. Before, I didn't really know much about Bill Wilson's story before this time, but still, if I'm not terminally unique, I'm not, I have no original ideas. So if I'm thinking this, there has to be somebody else and many others. And so in 2017, after a few months of a handful of people in New York City organizing, mainly to kind of not stoke controversy in mainstream circles. We just figured we would gather amongst ourselves. We went to the MAPS conference, and I put on the agenda a community gathering at the tail end of the conference, having no idea what to expect. And we had a packed room of over 50 people that showed up. So we transitioned the fellowship to being online. And so in 2017, we continued to trudge along until the pandemic happened. And then the demand for virtual recovery fellowships exploded, the prevalence of PIR meetings. And so our strongest offering is our frequency of meetings. And what we have kind of prioritized is growing a diverse fellowship of people to come and help us build a program together. We feel strongly that we can adapt as much as we want from pre-existing mainstream fellowships, but we really want to work together to create something that really embodies the principles of psychedelic integration and 12-step-based recovery. So obviously, real quick, our two most unique aspects of PIR is the fact that we recognize the utility of the use of psychedelics. That's not a requisite, right? That the requirements for participation in PIR is either being in pursuit of or identifying as someone in recovery from both a substance-related or a behavioral addiction, or similar to an Al-Anon program, you're the family member or loved one of someone with a primary qualification of one of those fellowships. So we're in the mold of the 12-step world, the sort of 12-step lineage that allows for the recognition that psychedelics done in an intentional way is not inherently done in the pursuit of an addictive lifestyle. And then furthermore, another thing that kind of uniquely qualifies us is the fact that we're serving as a bridge across the whole spectrum of 12-step recovery. So we embody the wisdom of these behavioral addictions fellowships, the substance-specific fellowships, and the family support groups to try to incorporate the wisdom from all across it.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that that story with everyone. I think it's just really inspiring to see, you know, what can come together when you start to think a little more broadly and try to share an idea and find others who may have experienced something similar. And if anybody else, I think you were referring to Psychedelic Science 2017 in Oakland, right?
Correct.
I'm sure there are a few other people on the call who were there, and it's just wonderful to know that this is something that, you know, that really grew out of an initial meeting there. And I believe you mentioned there will be additional gatherings coming up because we're in April now, in June. Do I have that right?
Yep, at the Psychedelic Science Conference in Denver this June, we will be having morning recovery meetings of PIR on the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday from 8 to 9 a.m. And so this is hopefully designed to kind of serve a function like a Zendo project, right? And kind of recognizing that folks that are in recovery or potentially struggle with substances, that even coming to a psychedelic conference and participating in all the festivities and the after parties and stuff might be a slippery environment for them. We want people to know that there is a recovery resource that will be there, including myself and some other founding members and key organizers for both the meetings, and then we'll have a table in the marketplace that will be staffed pretty consistently if people want to come say hi, learn more. But otherwise, you know, please check out the psychedelicsinrecovery.org website that includes, you know, basically our kind of founding philosophy, our guiding principles, our preamble, and then another other documents that have been put together in the past couple of years since our fellowship really started to grow.
Fantastic. It's a wealth of resources, and I encourage everyone to be knowledgeable about this, even if it's not something that you individually, as for your own person, will participate in or attend, but also because so many of us here are, you know, in the profession, in the field of being of help and assistance to others. And so this is a wonderful resource for people to refer people to. I know I've referred many people to it over the course of the years and just said, you should know about this, check it out, maybe today, maybe tomorrow, maybe 6 months from now. maybe 3 years from now. It's great to know that it's there and that it's going to be there for people. Great resource. All right. Well, I think maybe now would be a good time to share. I know you had an informational slide you wanted to share with some contact information. So since you just started bringing up some websites, why don't we post that up for a moment so people can see? Kevin's just going to screen share a slide, and I will say a few more things while he's doing that. And we will actually include, this is just giving you a QR code. So if you want to grab that with your phone and be able to get in touch. Kevin's available for, supervision, consultation, assistance in a variety of different manners, but I wanted to just share this with you. We will also include this in the email follow-up. So if you are missing it now, and don't worry, don't panic, we will get it to you. And we'll include the link and this QR code in the follow-up email that everyone will receive after this. And I wanted to maybe just have one more question for you, Kevin, before we go to questions for the audience, is if you could speak to what is your hope for the field of psychedelic therapy or psychedelic treatment for addiction specifically. What is your vision there? What would you like to see? I mean, we're coming up to Psychedelic Science 2023. We've got a number of, as you said, research projects are underway. There's, psilocybin's being explored. There's been some work with MDMA, but what's your vision here for just a better future coming out of all of this?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Elizabeth. And I mean, I think my broader sort of idealistic ambition for this, as much as I will appreciate the expansion of medicalized access to psychedelic assisted therapy and the role that it could play in helping to innovate the stagnant addiction treatment field, what my overarching goal here is really to see the kind of unraveling of the drug war. And I do sort of see the psychedelic medicalization as kind of serving as the tip of the spear to that effort. And, not everyone wants to kind of put that forward as much, because we are really being very careful to be mindful of the science. But I think in many ways, and especially when it comes to addiction, the journalist and author Maya Salovitz really loves to kind of nail this one about how can we really exist in a society that both recognizes the legitimacy of the disease of addiction and yet criminalize the very symptoms that are associated with that disease. It really just doesn't make sense to continue this proliferation of our carceral system. And so what I'm been particularly inspired by as a person who's been around the kind of psychedelic movement for a long time is the recent decrim efforts, like we have seen in Oregon with the passage of Measure 110 that decriminalized all substances. We're seeing some more kind of progressive reforms around that. But that's kind of my strongest hope, so that we can really embrace the idea of the community model of personal accountability and individual kind of mutual aid, rather, not individual, mutual aid sort of accountability measures. And I don't want to see kind of a Wild West thing going on, but I do want to really remove the criminal element from this whole thing, so that public health experts, educators, harm reduction resources can proliferate and receive the funding that they desperately deserve, because we've had a war on drugs now for almost a full century, coming up on we're over 75 years now, with trillions of dollars wasted. And so that's my biggest hope for the field. With specifics, real quick, to psychedelic medicalization, what I've been particularly inspired by is companies like Journey Collab, who are interested in implementing a psychedelic intervention into an existing addiction treatment model, rather than doing what we've seen with these kind of ketamine clinics that as a business have struggled in the past couple of months, that we've seen these big bankruptcies. And rather than kind of scale up and sort of reinvent the wheel of a boutique psychedelic clinic, we actually incorporate and integrate these innovative treatment interventions into existing models.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I do hope as well that this is, all of our work is part of a larger picture of reducing harms and unraveling the harms of the drug war, because they really touch everyone, and it's definitely not an individual, but a large community group effort. So I did post the link to psychedelicsinrecovery.org to the chat. I know you guys have a lot of questions, and there's a lot of resources that I'm sure you would like, and we might not get to everything. We're posting every possible link we could. But I also wanted to reiterate that for folks who are not familiar with Oregon's Measure 110, which Kevin just mentioned, I do think it is really one of the most far-reaching and progressive and potentially beneficial harm reduction measures statewide that we've seen, especially in modern times. So if you're interested in taking a deep dive into that, you're interested in just what can happen, please do check out. Just you can research it on your own. Oregon's Measure 110 decriminalization for drug decriminalization measure. And I thought it was all right, Kevin, do you mind if we turn to a couple of questions from our audience? Because these guys have been listening and they've been following along, and I see some active comments in the chat. I'm not going to try to read everything in there, but I do want to just turn to the questions here. One of them comes from someone who is in Oregon and asks, do you have any idea what insurance companies are going to do with psychedelic treatments that we quote know are working well, that are, I would say, that are in development in research studies at this time. But I think this is really asking, pending one day there is potentially an FDA approved psychedelic treatment for addiction that goes alongside the other drugs that are approved, like we have several that you mentioned, Vivitrol, Antabuse, et cetera. Do we know what insurance companies are going to do about that? Should that become the case?
I think it's a tough question, and I'm obviously not like a payer representative or involved in that model. There's a reason I'm in private practice, and the scope of my licensure, actually, private insurance doesn't recognize my license. I am able to accept Medicaid, which I do. But I think to answer in a somewhat indirect way, I think what I find most promising about the potential for insurance reimbursement or coverage of applying something like psilocybin in the existing addiction treatment models is that there is a pretty robust amount of coverage for various aspects of what we would call the continuum of care. So addiction, I talk a lot of smack about the addiction treatment industry, but unlike other mental health indications, the kind of intractable high acuity conditions, when it comes to addiction treatment, at least in the past several decades, there has been a very robust model of both detox, inpatient, residential for both short-term and long-term, outpatient groups, intensive outpatient groups, partial hospitalizations. It goes on. So there is a very well carved out model of really fine-tuning based on the American Society of Addiction Medicine, the ASAM criteria of care, which points people in the right direction. But so I think applying a psilocybin-based intervention to an existing outpatient group model or even an inpatient residential setting, it wouldn't be that much of a stretch to imagine insurance coverage of those services. In particular, right now, this is existing in research protocols. There's a physician, I believe he's a physician, a doctor in Oregon, Chris Stauffer, who is using a form of psilocybin-assisted therapy for 4 groups, I believe, for stimulant use disorder. Similarly, Matthew Johnson at Hopkins has a trial where they're recruiting methadone-maintained individuals who continue to struggle with stimulant use disorder, again, using a group model. And so these are going to be more lucrative, cost-effective measures that insurance companies will probably like to see. And if the outcomes are as robust as they have been in a lot of other clinical trials of psychedelics, it doesn't stand to reason that this won't be embraced by insurance companies pretty soon.
I certainly hope you're right about that. And it's true, though, the infrastructure's there, the groups are there, the sort of environments could be adapted, and I think could take this on in a very, very, very helpful way. I also know somebody who's working with ketamine for people who are in early recovery in a residential treatment um, detox and inpatient setting. So it is happening and it is possible. I think it can be integrated into the system that we have. And, there are certainly people in our field who sort of want to imagine something completely from scratch, but there's quite a lot there that is positive that I think we can work within those systems. I want to turn to another question, which is actually kind of related. Someone is asking from New York State how they can help a client who struggles with addiction, and asks if ketamine assisted psychotherapy is the safest legal place to start. Well, it's a great way to point out that what we're talking about here in this webinar, and many of the treatments that we've talked about in this webinar, I think we've made this clear, but we'll just reiterate it again. Ibogaine, psilocybin, MDMA are all not FDA approved for any treatment for anything. What we're referencing when we talk about our work or we talk about the trials that we've worked on, this is all happening in clinical research settings, which means that it's approved only within the context of that trial, or this is work that's taken place abroad. However, ketamine can be prescribed off-label as an off-label treatment, is a Schedule III drug, and it is relatively well known to be prescribed for mental health indications as well as for addiction. And again, it's off-label. But one thing that we haven't brought up yet, and I think it bears mentioning, is that there is actually a fair amount of research on the use of ketamine assisted therapy as a treatment for alcohol use predominantly, and I believe other addiction to other drugs. And that it does show potential to be helpful there. I would love to hear your thoughts on this, Kevin, but I don't know that it's it's such a common practice these days, but I do think that there's some precedent and there's certainly some research there.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just to kind of reiterate that, one of the indications that ketamine has long been studied for is with addiction a lot, with opiate and with alcohol use disorders. And so it is very, very much an appropriate and safe legal place to start when it comes to administering a type of psychedelic therapy. I think overall, like in any kind of therapy, and I know Fluence does a good job in doing this, is really highlighting the nature of the therapeutic alliance. And when ketamine is kind of thought of as one of these recreational drugs of abuse because it's known as a party drug in the rave scene, that might give some people pause about, well, why would I use a potentially addictive substance? And I really appreciate the angle that was covered in the Lucid News article that Elizabeth and I participated in before this webinar, that if you draw a contrast to the opioid crisis that we're now in, and sort of look at the epidemiological phenomenon that underscored how this has become such a huge crisis now, it's really not the proliferation of prescription painkillers to legitimate pain patients that created the crisis that we are now in. We're really talking about a saturated market of synthetic opioids that were diverted. But anyway, before I get too far afield to this question, I think in this container of a therapeutic container that is under medical supervision, we're likely to see very few people actually have ketamine be contraindicated to their addiction treatment. And the benefit of it is, unlike other psychedelics, ketamine would not require people to come off of traditional psychiatric medication, and it does also not interfere with maintenance therapies that I alluded to earlier. So really taking it either through a psycholytic or a psychedelic approach, the individual doesn't even need to necessarily achieve abstinence prior to initiating the treatment. It's obviously needs to be heavily individualized, and I'm not really giving clinical advice without knowing way more about this situation, but I think it is definitely a safe place to start.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one would really want to do their homework and make sure they have proper training and education in that area, but the potential there is really great. And I want to highlight what you said, which is that people would not need to necessarily come off of either psychiatric medications or or be abstinent prior to initiating work with ketamine, which I think is really important because those are some of the highest barriers that we see to entry into a lot of the sort of most available treatment centers and options that we have. Many treatment centers will require people to be abstinent before they come in and or to be off of psychiatric medications for whatever their rationale is. And it's a huge barrier. It's really a barrier for folks to get in. So just thinking very differently about what the possibilities there are with ketamine, because it's got such a good safety profile and it's used so routinely in emergency medicine. We have the kind of data that we have with it. So I really encourage those who are interested in exploring that area to do so with certainly with caution, but it could be really worth pursuing as an off-label treatment. We are just about at the end of time, and I don't want to go over, but I did want to ask Kevin if you have one more resource you could mention for anybody that's interested in as a clinician in learning more about ibogaine research and ibogaine, the history of ibogaine or ibogaine research. Any books or websites or articles that you would mention for clinicians who want to be able to speak to that from an educated manner for their patients who might be inquiring?
Yeah, and actually the two websites that I would recommend the best because of a good comprehensive bibliography that they've captured are the MAPS website. If you just Google, maps.org and ibogaine, it'll take you directly to the archive page or the page of articles that have been archived, as well as the ICEERS organization, ICEERS, has been doing fantastic clinical investigations, anthropological investigations, observational trials like the one I participated in. I will just flick you down the rabbit hole to start there, because ibogaine is indeed a deep rabbit hole to go down.
It really is. Great. I'm gonna mention one more thing on top of that, which is that Fluence, we have a number of training programs, especially in CAP and ketamine assisted psychotherapy and in psychedelic harm reduction and integration, which broadly cover a lot of things that are consistent with what we've spoken about today. So there's everything from initial one-off webinars or on-demand programs to longer pieces, reading and study groups, and entire certificate programs if you're really looking to really professionalize in this area. And we're very, very supportive of those who want to pursue this specifically to be able to work in the addictions field. It's needed, it's important. We've got contacts with great people like Kevin who come and do webinars and give us talks and help us educate the community in this way. So that's just another set of resources for you that are available. We're just at the end of our time, so I want to just thank everybody. We did post Kevin's contact information. We will do so again in the follow-up email, so please take a look for that, and we will be sending out a recording in the next couple of days. Thank you, Kevin, really for sharing this time with me and being here and speaking with the group.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I just want to add, if you had gone to my website and signed up for my to keep in touch with me and subscribe to updates, I'll be launching later this spring, early summer, deeper dive for clinicians in this topic on a weekly basis.
Great. Awesome. We look forward to seeing you here or there or at Psychedelic Science. And take care, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.